Hello, and welcome back to Science Storytime. We are continuing Chapter 2 of Alice in Quantumland. We have just met this guy, all right, and we are diving right back in. Well, now, he began, seating himself at his desk. He steepled his fingers together in the traditional magisterial manner to increase the dignity of his appearance. But this was not a good idea, as just then he gave such a particularly violent jerk that he got his fingers all tangled up, and he had to stop to unravel them. Well, now, he repeated, thrusting his hands deep into his pockets for safety. The thing you must remember about energy is that it is conserved, which is to say that there is always the same amount of it. It may convert from one form to another, but the total amount is always the same. At least it is if you take the long view, he added wistfully and sighed, staring mournfully into the distance. Isn't it true in the short term, then? Asked Alice, who felt that she should say something to keep the conversation going. Well, no, not entirely. In fact, not at all. If the term is short enough, you saw the Heisenberg relation on the notice outside the bank, didn't you? Oh, yes, I was told it gave the terms for the energy loans. Well, so it does in a way, but where do you think the energy for the loans comes from? Why, from the bank, of course. Dear me, no, said the accountant, looking slightly horrified. Most certainly not. It would be a fine thing if the bank started lending out energy from its own stock. No, he went on conspiratorially, looking around him carefully. It is not widely known, but the energy does not come from the bank. In fact, it does not really come from anywhere. It is a quantum fluctuation. The amount of energy that any given system has is not absolutely definite, but will vary up and down, and the shorter the time over which you measure it, the more it is likely to vary. In this respect, energy is not really at all like money. Money is well conserved in the short term. If you want to have money for some purpose, you have to get it from somewhere, don't you? You may take it out of a bank or borrow it from someone, or you might even steal it. I wouldn't do that, cried Alice indignantly, but the accountant continued, ignoring her. No matter where you get it, it has to come from somewhere. If you get more, then someone else has less. That is what happens in the immediate short term, at any rate. In the long term, it is different. You may get inflation and find there is more and more money about. Everyone has more, but it does not seem to buy as much as it did. Energy is quite the reverse in a way. In the long term, it is conserved. The total amount stays the same and you get nothing like economic inflation. Every year, you will need the same amount of energy on average to transfer from one state in an atom to another. In the short term, though, energy is not well conserved. A particle can pick up the energy it needs for some purpose without it having to come from anywhere else. It just appears as a quantum fluctuation. These fluctuations are a consequence of the uncertainty relation. The amount of energy you have is uncertain, and the shorter the time you have it, the more uncertain the amount you have. That sounds terribly confusing, said Alice. You do not have to tell me, answered her companion emphatically. It is. How would you like to be an accountant when the figures you are trying to balance are fluctuating all the time? That sounds terrible, cried Alice sympathetically. How do you manage? Well, I usually try to take as long as I possibly can to do the accounts. That helps a bit. The longer the period of time that I spend, the smaller the residual fluctuations, you see. Unfortunately, people will get impatient and come to me asking if I'm planning to take forever to balance the accounts. That would be the only way to do it, you see, he went on earnestly. The longer I take, the smaller the energy fluctuations. So if I did take forever, why then there would be no fluctuations and my accounts would perfectly balance, he cried triumphantly. Unfortunately, they just won't let me alone. Everyone is much too impatient and anxious to be off making transitions from one state to another all at the time. That is another thing that I wanted to ask about, remembered Alice. What are all these states that I keep hearing of? Would you explain them to me, please? I am not really the best person to do that. It is all part of quantum mechanics, so you really ought to go to the Mechanics Institute and ask them there. That is what I was told before, said Alice. If the best place to If that is the best place to ask, would you please tell me how I might get there? I am afraid that I cannot actually tell you how to get there. That is not the way we do things here. But I can arrange that it is very probable that you will get there. He turned to the far wall of the office, which was covered with a dusty curtain. When he drew this aside with a sudden jerk, Alice could see a row of doors spaced along the wall. "Where does each of those lead?" she asked. "Does one of them lead to the institute you were talking about?" "Each of them could lead you almost anywhere, including, of course, to the institute. But the point is that all of them will be very likely to lead you to the door of the institute." "I do not understand," complained Alice, with an all too familiar feeling of increasing confusion. "What is the difference? If each of them can lead almost anywhere, it is the same as saying that they all could lead almost anywhere." "Not at all. It is a different thing entirely. If you were to go through any one door, why then you might end up almost anywhere. But if you go through all at once, then you will most probably end up where you want to be, at the peak of the interference pattern." "What nonsense!" cried Alice. "I cannot possibly go through all the doors at once. You can only go through one door at a time, you see." "Ah, that is different. Of course, if I see you going through a door, then you will go through that door and no other. But if I do not see you, then it is quite possible for you to have gone through any door. In that case, the general rule will apply." With a wave of his wand, he indicated a large striking notice which was fixed on the wall in front of the desk where he could not avoid seeing it. It read, "What is not forbidden is compulsory." That is one of the most basic rules that we have here. If it is possible to do several things, you do not just do one of them, you have to do them all. The way it saves having to make your mind up very That way it saves having to make your mind up very often. So off you go. Just go out through all the doors, and when you have, then set off in every direction at once. You will find it is quite easy, and very soon you will have got to the right place. "This is ridiculous," protested Alice. "There is no way that I can go through several doors at once." "How can you say that until you have tried? Have you never done two things at the same time?" "Well, of course I have," answered Alice. "I have watched television while I was doing my homework, but that is not the same thing at all. I have never gone in two directions at the same time." "I suggest then that you try it," replied the accountant, rather huffily. "You never know whether you can do something until you try. That is the sort of negative thinking which is always holding back progress. If you want to get anywhere here, you have to do everything that you possibly can and do it all at the same time. You do not have to worry about where it will take you. The interference will take care of that." "How do you mean? What is interference?" cried Alice. "No time to explain. The mechanics will tell you about that. Now, off you go, and they will explain when you arrive." "This is really too bad," thought Alice to herself. "Everyone I speak to rushes me on somewhere else and promises me that I will get an explanation as soon as I get there. I wish that someone would just explain things properly, once and for all. I am sure that I do not know how I can possibly go several ways at the same time. It may it seems to me to be quite impossible. But he is so certain that I shall be able to manage it here that I had better try, I suppose." Alice opened a door and stepped through. Alice's many paths. Alice stepped through the left-hand door and found herself in a small cobbled square with three narrow alleys leading out of it. She walked down the left-hand alley. Before she had gone very far, she found herself on the edge of a broad paved area. In the center rose a tall, dark building with no windows on the lower levels. It looked very forbidding. Alice stepped through the left-hand door and found herself in a small cobbled square with three narrow alleys leading out of it. She walked down the right-hand alley. Before she had gone very far, she came to a park with weed-choked gravel paths winding between dismal drooping trees. Tall iron railings surrounded the park, and a dank mist obscured the scenery within. Alice stepped through the left-hand door and found herself in a small cobbled square with three narrow alleys leading out of it. She walked down the middle alley. Before she had gone very far, she came to another square in front of a rather shabby-looking building. Alice stepped through the right-hand door and found herself in a narrow alley with others branching off it. She walked down the left-hand alley. Before she had gone very far, she found herself on the edge of a broad paved area. In the center rose a tall, dark building with no windows on the lower levels. It looked very forbidding, and she had a distinct feeling she ought not to be there. Alice stepped through the right-hand door and found herself in a narrow alleyway with two others branching off it. She walked down the right-hand alley. Before she had gone very far, she came to a park with weed-choked gravel paths winding between dismal, drooping trees. Tall iron railings surrounded the park, and a dank mist obscured the scenery within. She had a very strong feeling that she ought not to be there. Alice stepped through the right-hand door and found herself in a narrow alleyway with two others branching off it. She walked on down the central alley. Before she had gone very far, she came to another small square in front of a rather shabby-looking building. Somehow, it seemed to her that this was the right place to be. Alice stepped through the center door and found herself facing a wall with three arched gateways, which led to alleys beyond. She walked down the left-hand alley. Before she had gone very far, she found herself on the edge of a broad paved area. In the center rose a tall, dark building with no windows on the lower levels. It looked very forbidding. She now felt very strongly that she ought not to be there. Alice stepped through the center door and found herself facing a wall with three arched gateways, which led to alleys beyond. She did not walk down the right alley at all, as the route somehow seemed to be completely wrong. Alice stepped through the center door and found herself facing a wall with three arched gateways, which led to alleys beyond. She walked through the gateway to the central alley. Before she had gone very far, she came to another small square in front of a rather shabby-looking building. She now felt quite sure that this was the place where she ought to be. Alice looked more closely at the building. On a faded board by the door, she could make out the words Mechanics Institute. This was indeed where she had intended to come. All right, so that concludes chapter 2. We will do chapter 3 at another time.